I'm reviewing a history book today. This is the Peloponnesian War by Donald Kagan. I was thinking in this review I would talk not only about this book, but also talk about the Peloponnesian War and why it's potentially interesting. That is why I wanted to read this book in the first place and why perhaps you might want to read this book. Now, I do have to admit I'm not an expert on the Peloponnesian War by any means, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, or, you know, drop me a line in the comments to give me some additional info or correct anything I might get wrong if you happen to know more about this. But it is something that I've been meaning to read up on for quite some time. And I'll maybe try and give you a brief rundown about why I think this could potentially be interesting and why I started this book in the first place and what I got out of it and maybe what I didn't get out of it. So I think most people are at least familiar with the name, the Peloponnesian War, right? And most people know that it's a long war that took place between Athens and Sparta. In fact, I got the impression reading this book that it's kind of like the Napoleonic Wars in the sense that it's actually a bunch of wars that all get grouped under the Peloponnesian War. So there's like the first Peloponnesian War, and then there's a peace, and then another war breaks out, and then there's another peace, just like with the Napoleonic Wars. But as just like with the Napoleonic Wars, historians tend to group it all as the Peloponnesian Wars. Actually, I was listening to a podcast on this, a history of ancient Greece by Ryan Stitt, and I think he mentions in that podcast that it's the influence of Thucydides that we just refer to the whole thing as the Peloponnesian War. I think he says if modern historians were doing the classifications, it would be classified into a bunch of different conflicts, but because this comes to us from antiquity, we call it the Peloponnesian Wars. Anyways, I'll try not to get stuck rambling down any dead-end tangents like that, but I'll do my best. So it's notable for a couple reasons. One is it happened right during the golden age of ancient Greece. So, the history of ancient Greece, you had the wars against the Persians that was covered in Herodotus, which I reviewed previously on this channel. The 300 Spartans, the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of Marathon, etc. And then once the Persians were defeated, that was kind of like the golden age of Athenian democracy, which lasted for like 100 years or something like that. And then the Peloponnesian Wars was these long struggle between Athens and Sparta, which effectively ended the golden age of Athenian democracy and ended up by exhausting both Athens and Sparta militarily. And I believe that's the reason that Alexander the Great and his father from Macedonia were able to march down and conquer the ancient Greek cities because Athens and Sparta had exhausted their military might in this long struggle against each other. So it's notable for that reason. It's not really studied that much in schools nowadays, but I think, like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, back in the old traditional schools when classical studies, the studies of ancient history, played a lot larger part in the curriculum then than it does now. I think the study of the Peloponnesian Wars was a big thing. And back in those days, I believe it was notorious for traumatizing schoolboys, just because it was a long, confusing war that went on and on and on and involved all these Greek states and had different Greek states switching sides and switching sides back again, and had a reputation as being long and boring and difficult to keep track of. It was also a war that encompassed like the whole of the Mediterranean world. So I mean, it's all up and down the Greek peninsula. All these battles, all over the Aegean Sea and over into modern day Turkey. In the early stages, Egypt was kind of tangentially involved. Carthage in North Africa gets involved at one point. There's a whole Sicilian expedition where Italy is involved, and Persia joins in the war. So it's been called like the World War of the ancient world because it involved kind of all the big powers of the time. So depending on your personality, I guess that's very confusing and intimidating, or intriguing and fascinating. But it is, yeah, this huge military conflict. Now, I became interested in it. I never really studied this in school, even though I was interested in ancient history as a schoolboy, but I never really read up much on Greek history. I liked Greek mythology, but in terms of history, I just went towards Roman history. Although looking back on it, I think I largely did that because that was just what the books in my school library led me to. I'm not sure how much of it was a conscious choice. But if you're in a middle school and high school library, there are all these books on Caesar and the five emperors, and there just seemed to be a lot more accessible stuff on Roman history. Roman history, I think, is much more straightforward, whereas Greek history can be a bit of a mess with all these different city-states switching sides and everything like that, and as in the Peloponnesian War. So, never really got into that when I was younger, but ever since I was in my 20s, I started to get little hints that this was an area of history that, even though I had missed when I was younger, could be potentially very interesting. Now, I've already mentioned why it's potentially not interesting. It's a long and endless war that just goes on and on and on and gets very confusing, and that's the common view of it. But if you're interested in politics or ideology or political theory like I was when I was younger, it's interesting because in addition to the military battle, there's also an ideological battle of sorts going on here between Athens and Sparta. Athens being the democracy, Sparta being the oligarchy, and Athens, when it was in the ascendancy, was attracting other Greek states throughout the Greek world to also emulate democratic governments. There's something in Donald Kagan. Maybe this is one of my minor complaints about this book. He frequently will mention that the democracies are allied with Athens and the oligarchies are aligned with Sparta. And for example, whenever there's a change of government in one of these Greek city-states, whenever they change from oligarchy to democracy or from democracy to oligarchy, that indicates they will change their allegiance from Athens to Sparta. It's not 100%. There are some democracies on Sparta's side. There are some oligarchies on Athens' side, but it seems to be a broad trend, quite similar to the Cold War in the 20th century. And in fact, many people have made analogies between the Cold War and the Peloponnesian War. It's something that Donald Kagan himself is fascinated by, the lessons of history. But if I do have a small critique, he doesn't really seem to explain what the logic is between. I mean, it doesn't really seem like Athens was. I'm not quite sure why there was an ideological component to this war. Like, did the Athenians view their mission as spreading democracy the same way the revolutionary France was trying to spread republics in the Napoleonic Wars? Or was Sparta trying to stamp out democracy? Like, the aspect of why that was happening never really gets developed in this book. I mean, he certainly talks about all the other causes of war, but in terms of the ideological alignment, I thought maybe that left me hanging a little bit. But there definitely seemed to be something going on there. The other thing that was interesting about this is it occurs during the stage of Athenian democracy that is at its most radical. So the people, the democratic reforms having been progressively pushed through over time, culminating in the democracy of Pericles, in which it seems that Athens was at its most democratic. So the people were voting on everything. Every free male citizen had the right to vote, and they looked like everything was controlled by a very direct democracy. Democracy is maybe one of the most abused words in the English language. A lot of governments today are claiming to be democratic, which are arguably not. But a point which Professor Kagan makes, not in this book, but in his lecture series. Well, I should mention he's available on YouTube for Yale Open Courses lecture series on ancient Greece, which I recommend. Check that out. I mean, a point that he makes is, in the United States, the people aren't really involved in voting on the everyday runnings of government. Like when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, people didn't actually go to the polls and vote for how they wanted the government to react. That was all done behind closed doors by the elected representatives and the not elected parts of government. But in ancient Athens, people were voting directly on military campaigns that they wanted to overtake, or how to punish cities that had been captured, or all of this stuff was put to the assembly and voted on. So that's really interesting. The kind of how the democracy functioned at its most democratic, leading into the Peloponnesian Wars. And also the connection between democracy and empire, because democratic Athens had an empire. So there were all these other city-states that were in the Athenian Empire, and not all of them were happy about it. They had to pay tribute to Athens. Some of them didn't want to, so Athens had to fight to maintain its empire and put down rebellion. And that was one of the causes of the Peloponnesian War, which gets into another interesting ideological thing, is the contradiction or the conflict between democracy and empire. And again, you can see this with the 20th century or the 21st century America. The noted critic of U.S. foreign policy, Noam Chomsky, at one point was asked, how can you criticize America when it's the freest country on earth? And Noam Chomsky said, well, Athens was the freest country in the ancient world, and they had an empire that did horrible things. So he said there is no correlation between the internal freedom of a country and its propensity to act in an imperial way, to have an empire. So that is interesting, because we tend to associate the problems with empire and militarism as being problems associated with autocracy or lack of popular control. And it's the Peloponnesian War in imperial Athens seems to indicate a case study against that, or at the very least something that's interesting to be explored. The other reason that this could be potentially interesting is something I hinted at briefly before, is that the Peloponnesian War took place right during the golden age of ancient Greece. Now, it struck me while I was reading this book, or while I was researching the Peloponnesian War, that the whole idea of golden ages in history is a little bit funny. It's one of those things maybe we don't think about so much. But when people talk about the golden ages of history, there's only a handful of times they're talking about. In Western history, it would be like the Athenian democracy, the Italian Renaissance, the Augustan age of letters in England. It's just like a few pockets, and in these few pockets, there's this enormous output of literature and philosophy and science and all that stuff which gets produced, and then the creativity seems to dry up for whatever reason. Now maybe this is just an illusion. Like maybe this is just an effect of the way we do history, that we tend to focus our attention disproportionately on these areas. I don't know. But if you look at history like it's traditionally done, it looks like there's these small little pockets of golden age. And then when they're over, then we go into like the dark ages or something like that. The creativity seems to dry up. And the golden age of ancient Greece, ancient Athenian democracy, was right up until the Peloponnesian War. There was like ancient Athens, if you trace the history of ancient Greece, like the Iliad, I think, came out in 800 BC or something like that. But that was before, that wasn't part of the Golden Age. That was like the pre-Golden Age. And then there was this period in the 4th century, this 50-year, 100-year period, where just all this Greek philosophy and science and literature got produced. So, like Socrates and Plato and all those famous Greek tragedies and the philosophy and the science you associate with ancient Greece. And it was happening during this period and being affected by this stuff. The more I researched this, the more I realized how much this golden age of ancient Greece was intersecting directly with the Peloponnesian War. So, for example, Socrates was a soldier in the Peloponnesian War. He fought in some of the battles. He was, by pure chance, happened to be one of the politicians during one of the political crises of the Peloponnesian War. The dialogues that Plato wrote involved some of the politicians from the Peloponnesian Wars. Plato was a young man during the Peloponnesian Wars. I guess Socrates was an older man. The famous Greek playwrights were generals in the Peloponnesian War, and a lot of those Greek tragedies were supposed to be references to stuff that was happening in the Peloponnesian War. For example, Trojan Woman, a tragedy about the Trojan War, was written during this time, and it was meant, a lot of scholars think, even though it was about the Trojan War, it was meant to be talking about the horrors of war that happened in the Peloponnesian War. Or there's a play I actually saw performed when I was younger, Lysistrata, an anti-war play about how all the women of Athens refused to have sex with any of their husbands until the husbands agreed to stop the war. That was written about the Peloponnesian War. So I am not nearly as well read as I should be, but perhaps like a lot of you out there on BookTube, I have ambitions. I want to read the canon someday, or I get around to as much of it as I can. And it strikes me that knowing the history of the Peloponnesian War is going to be very useful for that. So, sorry, I know I'm 20 minutes into this review and I've barely talked about this book, but I wanted to give that background on why potentially this is interesting. Okay, so the Peloponnesian War is primarily associated with a history book by Thucydides called The History of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides actually fought in the war and was an eyewitness to a lot of what he described. So it's an ancient history text. Now, this is not that, obviously. This is a popular history written by Donald Kagan. So he's taken Thucydides and he's kind of summarizing the important parts, because I think Thucydides is quite a massive book. I've not read it yet, and one of the reasons I decided to start with this book is because of some advice I got on Steve Donahue's channel. Steve Donahue, a prominent booktuber. If you know Steve Donahue, you know he does like 4 videos a day. So it's very hard to go back through his archive and find something when you need it. So I can't possibly give you the link for this. But on one of his videos, maybe on a couple of his videos, he mentioned his reading philosophy of when you're interested in a subject, don't go through for the hardest stuff first. He said you don't get any points for being really smart and trying to think you're really smart and going in for the most inaccessible text first. Start with the accessible stuff. Start with the popular stuff. So that's one of the reasons why I read The Peloponnesian War by Donald Kagan first rather than going directly to the ancient sources. Although I do hope to work myself up to the ancient sources someday. But for now, starting off with this. But as Donald Kagan makes clear in this book, it's not just Thucydides. A lot of the people in the war also were featured in Plutarch's biographies, and then like I just mentioned, this was happening right during the golden age of ancient Greece. So there are all these plays that reference it. There's all this philosophy that makes reference to what's going on. There's archaeology and inscriptions that have been found. There are other historians who fill in the gaps of Thucydides. So he's drawing on lots of different things to make a coherent story, which is yet another reason why I think this is probably good to start off with before jumping into the classic Thucydides. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I guess when you take that into consideration, when you take the fact that he is condensing a much larger work, the history of Thucydides, plus bringing in other examples, then you'd expect this book to be larger than Thucydides, not smaller. But he's obviously drawing on multiple sources, but condensing them or summarizing them. And in fact, he says right in his introduction that he wrote a 4-volume history on the Peloponnesian War. But that was for scholarly audiences, and you can't expect popular audiences to read that. So this colleague, he says a colleague of his convinced him that there was a market for a 1-volume history of the Peloponnesian War. So that's what he wrote. In his lecture series, he says it sold 50,000 copies, which I don't know anything about publishing. Apparently that's a lot. Sold 50,000 copies, and he said really surprised his publishers. He said surprised him as well. But he says, well, in retrospect, I shouldn't have been surprised, because people keep hearing references to the Peloponnesian War, right? They keep hearing that it's something they should read about, but they don't. Nobody wants. Your average person doesn't want to wade through Thucydides. So people have been waiting for an accessible book like this to get. And this book is readily available. It was published in 2003. I picked it up at the bookstores in 2019, and it was right on the shelves. I've noticed over the years that, I'm sure you've noticed this as well, because of everybody's ordering books online these days, bookstores they don't stock a lot on their shelves. So you've got a very limited selection of history books on the shelves, but this was one of them. At least it was the last time I was back home in the United States, which was 2019. I was still able to get this one off the shelves. So check your local bookstore. They might very well have it. Otherwise, go to Amazon. But yeah, because this is a one-volume history, you very much do get the feeling that he is just skimming over a much more complex, richer history. Now, I'm no expert on this, like I said, but just reading through this, you even as somebody who is not an expert, you feel like it's just rushing. So, for example, the First Peloponnesian War, he barely even mentions it. The part about Egypt in the First Peloponnesian War, I don't think that comes up at all. Carthage, which gets involved near the end of the Peloponnesian War. The podcaster I was mentioning earlier, Ryan Stitt, A History of Ancient Greece, he has like a whole episode on how Carthage enters the war. Donald Kagan just has a brief one sentence about Carthage's involvement in the war. So yeah, I mean, you are quite obviously missing out on the details here. This is very much, I guess, an introduction. And there were a lot of really fascinating personalities in here. The one that struck me the most, Pericles, which is a name like I had definitely heard around before. I mean, you're probably in the same boat, right? You've heard about Pericles, but you don't really know much about him if you're a normal person, I think. I don't know. Let me know what your mileage is on that statement, if you want. But Pericles is also briefly mentioned in the beginning part of this book, and he sounds like such a fascinating figure. I mean, he's somebody who's associated with the radical democracy phase of Athenian democracy, and yet he's also been accused of running the Athens like a one-man rule. And Donald Kagan tries to sort that out a little bit and say, okay, well, the systems of democracy were still functioning, but Pericles was just such a popular person that he was almost always able to persuade Athens to go along with what he wanted to do. He just sounds like a really fascinating person. And the whole Pericles funeral oration, which again is something like I keep hearing references to, but didn't really have a clear idea what it was until I read this book. Things like that. I really wanted to hear more about Pericles, but he's just mentioned so briefly, and then we're off to other characters. And this book is covering like a 30-year time span because the war just goes on and on and on. That you don't really have time to linger on one person too long. Alcibiades is another person who sounds really interesting. Kimon Nikias. Hopefully I'm pronouncing all these Greek names correctly. Otherwise, correct me in the comments. They all sound like fascinating people, and I really would like to have read more on them. But there's just no space in this book. It's just everything is going really quickly. The book is very clear and well written. There are no endnotes hidden in the back. There's an index, but no endnotes. There's one or two footnotes here, but the footnotes, actually, there's barely any footnotes. And when they are, they occur at the bottom of the page. There are maps which are, for the most part, right where you need them. They're in the text. So, I mean, when I was reading Herodotus, I complained a bit in my reviews of that book that all the maps were buried in the back. So, as you're reading through the text and you want to find where the city is, you have to flip to the back of the book. In here, the maps are not buried in the back. They're integrated with the text. So as you're reading it, yeah, the map will show up usually right where you want it. Occasionally you'll have to flip around a couple different pages, but the in text. I don't know if you can see that. You can't see that, can you? Okay, trust me on this. It says like see map 17 here, so it'll tell you when to go to the maps when you need to. So I found that much nicer after having just read Tom Holland's version of Herodotus, where I thought that the flipping back to the maps was a lot more cumbersome. So the prose is clear, it's easy to read, the maps are manageable, not a lot of endnotes. But I did at points get the feeling when I was reading this that it was just a list of battles. Like, okay, Sparta and Athens go over here and they fight this battle and Sparta wins. But then over here there's another battle and Athens wins. And then over here there's another battle and Sparta wins. And it's not quite like that. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but just this long war where you're just kind of following all those battles. And I already set up in my introduction that I am interested maybe in some of the ideas about the Peloponnesian War, and less interested in slogging through all the military campaigns. Now, that is a personal preference, because I know that there are some people who love the military aspect of it. I was a history major back at college. Some of my classmates, some of the people who go into history, just go nuts at this kind of stuff. And you know the type, right? The amateur military historian. Type of people who love to get out their maps and talk about troop dispositions and where the cavalry was deployed and all that kind of stuff. That is definitely in this book here as well. Now, because Donald Kagan is going through so much, he doesn't really get too in-depth on any battles, and some battles he just avoids describing completely. He just says, like Sparta won or something like that. But on some of it, sorry, I know this map is going to be in reverse image here, but you can see what I mean here, huh? He's got the positions of the Athenian camp and the ships, and kind of where all the there are a couple other maps like that where he's setting up the different troop dispositions. And this is the kind of book where you're occasionally talk about flanking maneuvers and attacking the right flank or surprise attack from the rear, and all those kind of things, which again, if that's your thing, and there are a lot of people who are interested in it, you're going to love this book, because this book is chock full of them. For me, I found those type of things to be a little bit less interesting. Now, I was never tempted to give up on the book completely, because it's all described clearly enough that I went along for it. But there were points when I was thinking to myself, I'm not quite sure what I'm getting out of all these battles. I guess I'm learning history, but in 5 years, I'm not going to remember all these battles. In fact, I don't even remember them now. Now that I've gotten to the end of the book, the battles that were all described at the beginning of the book are a little bit vague and hazy in my mind. Which army won at which battle at which town. And that is the majority of the book. So I'm still glad I read it, because I feel like I have more of a background on Peloponnesian War, which I could maybe use as a jumping off point for maybe getting into the aspects of this war which interest me more, or the aspects of the time period which interest me more. But But yeah, that is a big part of it. But there were also some really interesting stuff. So I mentioned I was interested in Athenian democracy and the conflicts in the ancient world, and that comes front and center in this book, right about page, where is it? Part 6, so page 325 or a little bit after. So as the war is beginning to go badly in Athens, there are a group of aristocrats who are beginning to think that the reason that the war is going so badly is because of democracy. Like these dumb voters just don't know how to vote for a good military campaign, and democracy is ruining everything. And that was apparently a view of a lot of people at the time, including apparently Thucydides, who was attributing a lot of the failures of the Athenian campaign to the populist leaders over-promising and the voters voting for things that made no common sense. Now, again, take me with a grain of salt because I've not read Thucydides. But Donald Kagan seems to be in this conversation or this argument with Thucydides throughout this book. And this is also something that comes up in his lectures on YouTube, the Yale Open Courses lectures, where he actually does not think, that Donald Kagan does not think that this is a failure of democracy. Donald Kagan thinks that some of the things that Thucydides thought was really stupid actually made sense to the voters at the time, given the context and you know the fact that things always didn't turn out so well was often just because of unpredictable future or because of hindsight. But nonetheless, I guess the perception of the period by some of the intellectuals and the elites, the oligarchs, the aristocrats, was that the democracy was failing the war. So then he's got a couple chapters where he talks about this ideological struggle, and he talks about the aristocratic tradition, and saying that, okay, we're at the point in history now where it's the most radical phase of Athenian democracy, but that does not mean that these aristocratic critics of democracy have gone away. They have always been there in the background, and talks about some of the writing from this period about people criticizing how the common masses didn't have nobility in them, or they didn't have good sense. And so this was a very common idea. And this growing oligarchic movement to overthrow democracy, which finally succeeds with a coup and then a lot of political assassinations. But it's undermined almost immediately by divisions among the plotters between the very extreme oligarchs and the less extreme plotters, as well as it causes an uproar in the army and navy. The army, because they were lower class, was extremely pro-democratic. And the Navy as well was very pro-democratic. And, apparently the reason that Athens had such a strong Navy in the first place is because the democratic government, which I'm beginning to forget exactly, there was some sort of connection between the Navy and democracy. I guess because under the democracy, they were all free citizens, so they wanted to serve in the Navy, something like that. So it creates not only this internal civil war going on in Athens almost, but also this conflict between the soldiers and the government. And all the political assassinations that happen after the oligarchs seize power remind me of coups in the 20th century, like when the fascists seized power in Argentina and immediately went on this wave of terror against their democratic opponents, or other similar things in history. So the conflict between the oligarchs and the Democrats in Athens, and not only in Athens, but these mini civil wars were breaking out in lots of cities across the Greek world during this time. That kind of thing I thought was very interesting, and that makes up a good section of the second part of the book. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting things in here, even for somebody like me. I should note, actually, I neglected to say this earlier. Donald Kagan is not a pacifist. He believes that war is sometimes necessary. He is, I mentioned at the beginning of this video, to me, one of the interesting things about this period is the anti-war literature it produced, the anti-war plays coming out of Athens during this time. Donald Kagan doesn't really talk about that. So if that's your primary interest, be forewarned ahead of time. I think this book would still be valuable for you, giving you background on what's happening, but that's not his primary interest. Donald Kagan seems to take a very critical view of the peace movement in Athens in his book. I got the impression, and maybe this was just me, I got the impression that in his video series he was somewhat more sympathetic to them. I don't know, maybe that was just my impression. But in the book, he does not seem very sympathetic. Make of that what you will. There's Athens settles for a peace, kind of midway through the book, the Peace of Nicaeus. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, Donald Kagan is of the opinion that Athens settled for that peace just because of war weariness. And he gives the impression that he views war weariness as like a character defect. Like, you've got to be strong and see this war to the end. You don't want to give up just because you want an easy life of peace. So, if you're sympathetic to the anti-war sentiments throughout history, which, not to give too much away, is my own ideological background. It's an opposing viewpoint. That being said, just on a personal note. Okay, on a personal note, I'll go on a brief digression here. When I've self-identified as a pacifist for many years, starting when I was in college and continuing through my 20s and 30s. But now that I'm older, I've been trying to, not only with pacifism, but with all my ideological positions, is to avoid ideological rigidness. So to always consider the possibility that any one of my positions could be wrong, and that I have to be open-minded to listen to people from the other side. And that's the position with which I approach this book. And I think Donald Kagan does make some interesting points here, where he says, a peace that just finishes the fighting and just goes back to the status quo is very often not a good peace. He says you want a peace that's going to avoid the next war and going to maybe put you in a position of strength so that your adversary is going to be not likely to attack you in the following war. And he seems to think that because Athens was affected by war weariness, they settled for a peace which did nothing to ameliorate the underlying tension between Athens and Sparta, and was just put Athens in a weaker position when the war inevitably did resume. Well, he knows more about it than I do, so I thought his perspective was interesting. But yeah, he mentions some of the anti-war plays coming out. There was one he talks about which I wasn't even familiar with, called Peace. The title of it was Peace by Aristophanes. I hope that's right. But he talks about it somewhat in a critical way, and he doesn't even mention in any of the other literature that was coming out. Yeah. So there are certain themes that he's interested in, and then certain themes that he's not interested in. He's very interested in the analogy of the Cold War. He's interested in the problem of these alliances, because both Athens and Sparta built up all these alliances to protect them from war. Athens had the Delian League, Sparta had the Persian League. No, those aren't the correct names, are they? But you know what I mean. There's the Peloponnesian League and there's the Delian League. And I guess a lot of people have likened this to the outbreak of World War I, where you have this whole system of alliances that's meant to protect you against war. But what it really is just, the powder keg, which is waiting for a spark to go off, to borrow an overused analogy for World War I. And then again with the Cold War. Now, the Cold War never went hot. I mean, it never went off, but it almost did at numerous points throughout history. Donald Kagan talks about how Athens and Sparta, once they had set up these alliances, had difficulty controlling their allies. And sometimes their allies would get into entanglements, which would then force them into military engagements that they would have just they wanted to avoid. And that was, I believe, what sparked off the Second Peloponnesian War, is the over-aggressiveness of the Allies. So various analogies to that in Cold War history, when cases where the Allies caused military engagements, even though the Cold War never fully evolved into a world war. In fact, I'm told that for years, if you wanted to study international relationships or histories of the Cold War, you had to read Thucydides. Now, of course, this isn't Thucydides. This is Donald Kagan, but this is perhaps the next best thing if you don't want to slog your way through Thucydides. Okay, I think I've rambled on long enough here. I probably could find other interesting things to talk about this book if I wanted to, but I've rambled on long enough. Yeah. So this is the kind of book where the people who are predisposed to be interested in this know exactly who they are. The people who would never want to read this book in a million years know exactly who they are. But if you're interested in this kind of thing, it's well written. So I'd give it a recommend. 8 out of 10 stars, in my opinion.